GDP and are major engines of economic growth. So my opponent's entire argument is basically economic growth leads to poverty reduction. We can see that the middle income countries, or the countries who have the economic growth, actually have 73% of the world's poorest. Now this is because prioritizing economic growth does not help the health of the individual. It does not help the health of the individual. Now sustainable energy clearly does, and we'll look to that in a few voting issues. Next, moving on to his responses of basically contention one. He argued that sustainability is too expensive and he doesn't really see a poverty reduction. Well, my first response is no poverty reduction through prioritizing economic growth. No poverty reduction through prioritizing economic growth. My second response is sustainability is more affordable. Sustainability is more affordable. Now here we see again, my opponent did not respond to the evidence stating, specifically he talked about the theory behind it, but he didn't respond that sustainable energy in UK was actually $6.4 billion cheaper than if they would have prioritized economic growth. Now I believe that is a clear example of how sustainability is very affordable. And if that's not sufficient enough, we'll look to my application one under contention two, of Curitiba, Brazil. Now again, this was a small, poor city in Brazil that took the unconventional approach of not prioritizing economic growth. And when they did that, we saw that they did not have a reduction of pollution, public space, or even general poverty. So basically the sustainable energy approach in Curitiba, Brazil was the strongest of all Brazil, as opposed to significantly only prioritizing economic growth. Now this next response is about India and basically that not exclusivity. My first response is empirical example. Now if you think that India wasn't valuing the environment at all, that's exactly my affirmative opponent's argument, that this is an example of when they prioritize economic growth, we see a loss of human life. My opponent has not demonstrated that we can somehow have environmental protection with economic growth. Now we argue that through the environmental Kuznets curve, but that is not actually the case. When we look to my voting issues, I'll be responding to that. Now his next responses were essentially that people die from poverty, and then again with the basic needs and the resource efficiency. Now my first response is basic needs are useless if you're not alive. Basic needs are useless if you're not alive. Now again, my opponent never responded that 13 million people die per year, but he's saying, no, it's fine. We can look to the economic growth and the basic needs, and we can have a nice house, and then that leads to food. But if they are dying from pollution, that doesn't even matter, which is why we need to take the immediate step, reduce the loss of life, and value sustainable energy, and not prioritize economic growth. So let's look to a few voting issues. Voting issue number one is prioritizing economic growth kills. Prioritizing economic growth kills. Now again, I kind of hate to keep harping on this number, but it's very significant. 13 million people die per year. 25 to 30% of deaths globally are from specifically prioritizing economic growth. Poverty reduction, as I have even demonstrated, isn't a clear benefit from economic growth, is not significant when you compare this loss of life to a potential poverty reduction. So let's look to voting issue number two. Sustainability is achievable. Sustainability is achievable. Now my opponent mentioned some basically rhetorical and analysis responses of how sustainability probably won't even work. This is just one example. We can't really base our time and effort on this. Well, I'd just like to point out that the United Nations Environmental Program developed a specific 14-case study discussing that sustainability is not only the best way to improve the economy without sacrificing the environment, but is actually extremely possible. Now those are 14 specific examples of different countries or cities who have prioritized sustainability and have found a significant advantage. My third and last voting issue is, sustained prosperity. Sustained prosperity. Now my opponent never responded to this argument that even if we do prioritize economic growth, that will very quickly burn out, as we see that environmental protection is what sustains economic growth and long-term prosperity. So my opponent never responded to that, basically agreeing with the argument that sustained prosperity relies on valuing the negative side of sustainable energy. Thank you.
2 minutes remaining. Minute and a half remaining. One minute remaining. 30 seconds remaining.
Let's start out this final affirmative speech by addressing the arguments brought up by the negative, starting out with the irreversible damage argument and the pollution deaths argument. So my response to this argument is the term pollution that, again, was kind of dropped in the last speech. So here's the thing, is that I brought up analysis that 44% of the deaths that are caused by pollution are due to that method of gaining heat that individuals are subjected to only when they don't have the economic growth necessary to get out of poverty. And the thing is that that's a significant amount. That's the single biggest cause of pollution, and therefore the biggest cause of pollution-related deaths. So economic growth would fix. Underneath my opponent's second response, that without sustainable energy, there's not poverty reduction, and then the middle-income countries argument, I have two responses. My first response is that this is a new argument. So my opponent established this line of questioning in cross-examination, but never argued this in her constructive speech. So I would totally count this as a new argument, and I urge you to strike it from your flow. But I can go ahead and respond to it anyway. So my second response is that maybe middle-income countries just literally have more people living in them, and therefore maybe literally have the majority of the world's poor, because there's a lot more people that live in middle-income countries than low-income countries. We don't know. Okay, let's move on to the next argument that talked about how their sustainability is more affordable. And she mentioned Great Britain, which is really interesting because I brought up analysis in my first speech about Great Britain. In Great Britain, people are literally dying. Excess winter deaths have increased because people can't afford to heat their homes. Sustainable energy is a great concept. It's not affordable even for the developed world, let alone the developing nations. Let's move on to the next argument. My opponent talked about how India was an empiric example. My response is, again, priority. So here's the thing, is that in India, there's no way that you could say that that is priority and not exclusivity. If it literally has the worst air quality of any country in the world, if that's not an example of exclusive economic growth over environmental protection, then I don't know what is. Let's move on to the last argument that I flowed, which was about how basic needs are useless without life. My response is that the analysis under this point was dropped. So the thing is that, again, the analysis stands, economic growth will reduce poverty. But what's more, when you try to invest in sustainable energy policies, we brought up a quote in the first speech talking about how telling poverty-stricken nations to invest in wind energy and solar energy just drives their citizens further into poverty, and that's a very, very scary standard. Okay, the last argument was about the EKC, and my opponent said this was basically a theory again. So my response is just basically, does it make sense to you? Does it make sense that more developed nations have cleaner economies? It does to me, or cleaner environments. It totally does to me, because it looks like when you have more money, then you can protect the environment better than someone who's struggling just to meet the basic needs of their citizens. My one voting issue for you today is the resolution. We've proven that poverty is reduced with the affirmative position. We've even proven that pollution is reduced with the affirmative position because the single biggest cause of pollution is due to individuals in poverty. So for that reason, more than anything else, please vote aye. Thank you so much.